Lemon Amiga presents a Playguide video review. Sit back and enjoy the show.
Hey there, welcome to another Lemon Amiga play guide and review. In this week's show we'll be checking out Atomic Robo Kid, developed by Software Studios and released by Activision in October 1990. Atomic Robo Kid is a side-scrolling shooter developed by UPL and released in the arcades originally in November 1988. The game begins with a very simple title screen and a rendition of the arcade music. We can also see the titles of the Amiga version. So let's press fire, let's check this game out. In this game we control a futuristic robot, and the first thing we must do is collect our flying ability from the tokens at the beginning of the first level. And these boulders, you can see, won't damage us, but we can't fire inside those either, and sometimes we might just get delayed simply by getting stuck through those. But you can see the enemies have now started to appear, and with this basic firepower all we can do is to keep hammering that fire button. You can see flashes there which denote that I am actually firing. What we have to do is collect an upgrade firepower, and that should make the job much easier. There are 4 types of weapons in this game. The first one being the beam laser you can see we are using at the moment, which stretches all across that screen, and by shooting the flying objects that will reveal a token. Shooting that token will cycle through the weapons at random, and if you leave that blank that will be simply points. But at the moment we are struggling with the one main weapon in the first level, and if we get touched by any of the enemies that won't matter, but if we get touched by their firepower then that really will damage us because we'll lose a life straight away. There is no energy in this game, there is simply lives, and if you get touched by the wrong thing it's game over. Let's select another weapon. That's the 5-way spread. That certainly makes life easier on this first level, because as you can see this tunnel is rather narrow, and that means that the enemies have a funnel in which to get through, and in that funnel we can blast away with our firepower. You can see we are actually collecting another weapon. That's the bomb weapon, and the bomb will actually get rid of not only the enemies but the enemies' firepower as well, but that's pretty difficult to use in tight spots. When we die we will lose our current weapon, and if we hold down that fire button we can cycle through our weapons in order. That means we can cycle through those weapons on the move. So if you are just about to get killed, hold down that fire button and hopefully your weapon will swap to one which isn't vital for the level. We can also collect a speed up, which is so we picked up, and that means that we can move around just that little bit quicker. And with the 5-way spread we have to avoid all the firepower, but with other weapons we can simply wade into that action. Just like the arcade, a huge spinning fan will block our progress, and you need to shoot that from high up, and then you can avoid all these projectiles which aren't really hard to avoid. And at this stage there is no time limit throughout this entire game, so we can milk these levels infinitely, but we have to progress in order to get through to the next stage. So let's just move above where that projectile is launching and simply take care of the enemy, and as you strike that, that will pause on the screen, so if you repeatedly hammer that at close range, that simply disappears. The second fan guards the exit to the first level, and unfortunately I've got blown up before we get anywhere near that. And no, you cannot simply run through the enemy and make your way towards that exit, because that invulnerability only lasts maybe 1 second, and in that 1 second you have to make your way there or die. On the second level, the alleyways become even narrower and those enemies become even more tricky, particularly because we've lost all our upgrades. So sometimes those enemies respawn as soon as you leave the screen, so you have to tackle those. If you leave the screen and return, they will all respawn, so you have to get stuck in, otherwise you are wasting your time. But of course, with this weedy first weapon, that is easier said than done. We gain 3 lives per continue, and you can see that we gain a place on the high score table after every single continue. So let's just hit that fire and try again, and the enemies have nicely disappeared, dropping us onto a bonus pickup. This is the laser weapon, and we have also picked up a bomb as well, which is probably the most important weapon in this entire level, because the bomb makes sure that we can get rid of all this firepower. But the laser also works because that moves in a diagonal, and as long as you knock out those enemies, it doesn't matter how you do it, as long as they disappear. So simply moving to the edge of that screen made those enemies respawn. Luckily that diagonal weapon does move through the scenery, so you don't have to be pixel perfect with your aim, and the bomb weapon should, as we shall see, make that job a lot easier. Moving the controller and pressing fire in the direction we wish to fire means we can aim that bomb in any of the 8 directions, including straight up and straight down. And when respawning enemies appear above and below, sometimes you really need that to take on the enemies, otherwise you are vulnerable and you have to fight your way out of trouble. Sometimes pressing the fire button too quickly will toggle those weapons unintentionally, and that's something to watch out for in this game. I unintentionally swapped to the bomb, but now that we have the weapon of choice, it won't be long now, hopefully, before we get to that end of level boss. And that's a life over straight away. Sometimes you can lose lives needlessly in this game, and of course you have to avoid all that firepower, and you don't really want all those enemies to respawn, so you can't really run too far away. The end of level 2 Guardian is a little more tricky than the one we found at the end of level 1, but using similar firepower tactics, finding a nice safe spot and striking that while the iron is hot, you can usually get rid of it within maybe 10 blows. Eventually we will get enough hits together to destroy that thing, and that guards the 2 doors which go on to the next levels, and that gives the player a chance to fork and choose their route through this game. Unfortunately, I have died trying to get there, and it's certainly infuriating to do that in this game, because this game should be a little bit easier, but unfortunately it isn't. once again, moving off that screen has simply revealed more enemies, and we can blast through that scenery with that weedy weapon, but unfortunately dodging around on the landscape isn't a very opportune way to tackle that level. So this is yet another game where the best power-ups really aid the player, and if you lose those power-ups then you will be defeated more often than not. But with no time limit, the player can take their time, of course, and no idea really why I took on that boss directly, but with all the time in the world, surely there is a means to this end. I've chosen to take the top route through the game, and that reveals a nice wide open, very fast level in which we can really accelerate around that screen and collect those power-ups and destroy those enemies. Unfortunately, dodging all this firepower in such a wide open space, which is pretty action-packed at this point, really reveals the depth of this game, and the game is just beginning to come alive now that we've moved off the training levels and we can now blast away to our heart's content. To accompany these huge graphical levels, we also get great music as well, and that's one of the better parts of the game. Many people complain about the graphics not being arcade perfect, but I don't really mind this music. In fact, this music is far less annoying than the original arcade version. That's the route I like to go, most likely because of a bug in the game, which we shall see later on as we try again to play this game, but that's our 2 continues used up. So let's press that fire button and let's try to get further using a different route. Robo Kid was produced by Nick Dawson, who was in charge of converting most of the Activision Sega licensed games, which made it to the 8-bit home computers and later on the 16-bit machines, including Power Drift, Super Hang-On and Sega's Afterburner. This was coded by Jeff Gammon, who, among his other hits, he started out with games such as Moon Buggy on the Commodore 16+4 machine in 1983, and moved on to things like Hunt for Red October on the Commodore 64 in 1987, and his first entry on the Amiga was Altered Beast, released in October 1989, a full year before this. He then moved on to the consoles with Outlander, and back to the Amiga with Pierre Le Chef in 1993, and he's also credited for creating extra code in the game Alfred Chicken. He then moved on to the Harry Potter series and was actually the executive producer on the Syndicate remake, which appeared in 2012. Graphics were created by Mac Computer Graphics, and no idea who Mac Computer Graphics was, but I think they did a very good attempt at the arcade graphics. Many people complained, but I think with the backgrounds and the details and the small nature of the original arcade machine, which you can see at the moment, I think they converted those graphics absolutely fine. In fact, probably as good as they could do on the Amiga and still maintain those frame rates. Music is credited to Martin Walker, who also created the music to 9 Lives, Dragon Breed, Hunter, and the Legends of Valor game that we reviewed in Series 1, and he also created the music for Frenetic, which is a very polished arcade style shoot 'em up, and that is very lowly rated, but it had great music. Final credit is Rob Northern, who created the copy protection for this game. Rob Northern started out working with David Braben and Ian Bell on Elite. He created the copy protection for that, and that simply led on to other copy protection compression routines further on down the line for games like Thunderstrike, James Pond 2, Robo Kid, Project X, Walker, Wiz and Liz, Cannon Fodder, Body Blows, and then he moved on to games such as Batman Forever in 1995. On the Amiga, many Lemon Amiga users on the Lemon Amiga website complained this game was still too tough for its own good, maybe a lot easier than the arcade version, which required the player to insert coins pretty quickly, but still not very easy. And this game was also released on the Commodore 64 and many other conversions, and they say that the Amiga version is actually more playable than the arcade original. And I can say that this is a faithful conversion. It's certainly not a bad conversion by a long stretch, and if you have that weaponry, then these enemies aren't too much of a big deal, and all the player really has to do is to take their time and hopefully use the correct weaponry to get through to the bosses. So this time I'm actually going to lure the boss behind this wall, and then hopefully he will be able to hit me, but I can simply traverse the wall and take my time to get rid of him. This time, despite swapping our weapons over by mistake, we do actually have access to those doors, and for this I'm actually going to use the wrong way, which is the lower way, which is actually a way that I can actually get further on, but which crashes the game a little later on. And as you can see, the level once again opens out into a frantic firefight with great level backgrounds, and you can see that this is really trying on the Amiga. Point the game really opens up, and as soon as we reach these levels we really do get a thrill battling our way through these, but as you can see it's still no easy ride, and even though these levels have speeded up, it's still not particularly easy, so you have to really run sometimes for those exits and defeat the enemies the easy way. That opens the door to our first end of world boss, and in this case it's one of those mechanized aliens, which has those guns, of course, which you need to knock out. And I'd probably recommend the beam laser for this, or perhaps the 5-way to really try to get an impact on that guy. But, of course, if you go the wrong way, you'll die. Like most end of level bosses, all you have to do is to rotate around that thing and try to avoid its firepower, and once you've rotated around, hopefully with that beam laser enough times, you can then blow that thing up. The explosion effect is pretty reminiscent of the arcade original, and just like the arcade, once we get to this 4th level we get to take on another robot in a war machine game, and here we have to blast through those asteroids and then shoot the robot on the other side. And this mini war game could have been a public domain demo, but instead it really is taken from the arcade original, and this is sometimes at random, particularly when you have to blast through, and that robot endlessly seems to avoid our firepower. Finally, I managed to activate the laser weapon, and now the beam laser can take care of all these enemies. And again, level 5, we find an enclosed space and somewhat of a maze, although this maze is pretty linear, we can't get lost. The firepower, of course, has to be taken out first time every time, and it helps if you know these levels, and then you can simply wade in, all guns blazing, and know where to duck. Again, I think there is nothing wrong with these graphics. They did as good a job as they could do, given the fact that we were not even in the 1990s properly, and October 90 is when this game was released. It's certainly got the background and the shaded effect, which gives the depth to these levels, and if you can imagine this game with a solid black background, then that's what we could have had, but to my mind, even now, these graphics still stand up. Unfortunately, going this way leads to a bug in the crack of this game, and because I'm using the WHD load version, that uses exactly the same crack, and that exposes exactly the same bug, which literally crashes the machine. Moving on to the scores, the lowest score and the current score on the Lemon Amiga website is 65%. Amiga Format gave this game 75%. Zap gave the Amiga version 80%, CVG gave it 81%, Amiga Action gave this game 83%, and CU gave the game 86%. In November 1990, they complained about the graphics, but they said that this is mindless fun. And I agree, once the player gets deep into the game, it can become infuriating, but it's also mindless fun. And so thank you once again for viewing another Lemon Amiga Play Guide and Review.